said step away from him. Step
He
away
collapsed. He has no pulse. I am doing CPR. I am certified.
Someone call an ambulance.
Let him work. If I stop, he will die. I took a CPR course. I know what I'm doing.
Please. Officer Brent Callum heard the commotion from the north end of Renfield Park and moved toward it with his hand already on his weapon. His conclusion already formed, his mind already closed to any version of events that did not match what he expected to find when he got there. What he found was a 17-year-old black boy on his knees performing CPR on a collapsed man while everyone around him either watched or ran. Callum told him to stop. The boy kept going. Callum told him again and threatened to use force. The boy looked up and said he was saving a life and went back to compressions. Callum shot him in the foot. What Brent Callum didn't know was that 14 witnesses had seen the whole thing, that the man on the ground survived because of what that boy did, and that by the following morning his name would be attached to one of the most publicly condemned uses of force in the department's recent history. Before we go further, what city or country are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. We love seeing where you're tuning in from. Here at JPTV, if you believe that a black teenager who saved a stranger's life deserved a medal and not a bullet, then hit that like button and subscribe. Because we tell the stories that remind people exactly what kind of world we are still living in and exactly what it costs the people least able to afford it. Solomon Mensah was 17 years old and had spent the better part of that Saturday the way he spent most Saturdays when the weather was good and his homework was done outside, moving, present in the world in the way that teenagers are when they have not yet learned to be anywhere other than exactly where they are. He lived with his mother and younger sister in a ground floor apartment on Crestfield Avenue in the Renfield district, 4 blocks from Renfield Park, and the park had been part of his life for as long as he could remember. He had learned to ride a bike on the Eastern Path. He had played his first organized football match on the grass field near the south entrance when he was 9 years old. He knew which benches got the afternoon shade and which drinking fountain near the Central Path ran cold, even in summer. He was a junior at Renfield High School on Aldgate Street, where he maintained a B average across his subjects and was known by his teachers as a student who asked good questions and took longer than most to be satisfied with an answer. His football coach, a man named Terrence Obie, who had been running the school's program for 11 years, described him in a statement he would give several weeks after this Saturday as one of the most reliable young men he had worked with, the kind of player who made everyone around him better not by being the loudest, but by being the most prepared. Solomon had been part of the school's first aid training program the previous autumn, a 12-week course run in partnership with the Renfield District Red Cross chapter on Whitmore Avenue, and had received his CPR certification in November. He had taken the course seriously. He had practiced the compressions until the rhythm was in his hands rather than just in his memory. He had not known, when he pressed his palms flat against the chest mannequin in that community room on Whitmore Avenue, that the certification was going to matter in the way it was about to matter. He entered Renfield Park through the Crestfield Avenue gate at 2:18 in the afternoon. He had his headphones around his neck, not in his ears, because he preferred to hear the park when he walked through it. He was wearing dark gray shorts, a white t-shirt, and the same pair of worn running shoes he wore for everything. He had no particular destination inside the park that afternoon. He was just walking, the way people walk when they have nowhere specific to be, and the afternoon is long, and the air is decent, and the world outside their front door is temporarily more appealing than the one inside it. Albert Druce was 61 years old and had been coming to Renfield Park on Saturday afternoons for the better part of a decade. He lived alone in the apartment on Fenwick Road, 2 streets north of the park's main entrance, and had developed the habit of walking the Central Path loop after his wife passed 4 years ago. Partly for the exercise his doctor had been recommending since his first cardiac event in 2019, and partly because the stillness of his apartment on weekend afternoons had become a thing he needed to get away from for at least an hour. He was a large man, broad across the chest and shoulders, with the slow, deliberate walk of someone who had been told to take it easy and was trying to comply without fully surrendering to the instruction. Solomon noticed him first near the central fountain, about 40 meters ahead on the main path, walking slowly in the same direction. He did not think anything of it. He adjusted his pace to avoid walking directly behind him and moved slightly to the left of the path to give him room. Albert Drews collapsed at 2:34 in the afternoon. He went down without a sound. Not a shout, not a word, just a sudden absence of upright movement that turned into a man on the grass beside the central path, with his legs folded underneath him and his right hand open against the ground. The people closest to him reacted first. A woman with a pushchair who screamed and stepped back. A man in a running vest who stopped and stood and looked and did not move. Two children who had been feeding pigeons near the fountain who turned toward the sound and then turned back to their parents. Within 30 seconds, the area around the central fountain had gone from the ordinary noise of a Saturday park to something louder and less organized. People moving away from something rather than toward it, the way crowds move when they're frightened and don't know what the right thing to do is. Solomon was 25 meters away when Albert went down. He saw it happen. He was moving toward the fountain already, and the distance closed in seconds, and he was kneeling beside Albert Drews on the grass before most of the people around him had finished deciding what to do. He checked for breathing the way he had been taught. Head tilt, chin lift, 2 seconds of observation. There was none. He felt for a pulse at the neck. There was none. He straightened up on his knees, placed the heel of his right hand on the center of Albert's chest, covered it with his left, locked his elbows, and began compressions. 30 compressions, 2 breaths, 30 compressions, 2 breaths. The rhythm his hands already knew. Someone in the crowd called 911. Someone else was recording on their phone. A woman standing near the fountain said out loud that the boy knew what he was doing and told people to give him room. Most of them did. The crowd had reformed into a rough circle around Solomon and Albert, close enough to watch, far enough to stay out of the way, and the noise level had dropped from panicked to the particular concentrated quiet of people watching something that requires their silence. It was in this state. Solomon on his knees, compression steady, the crowd watching, the 911 call already made, that Brent Callum entered the scene from the North Path. Callum was 41 and had been with the Renfield District Police Department for 12 years. He was assigned to the weekend park patrol rotation, a relatively low-intensity posting that involved walking or cycling the park's main paths during peak hours and responding to minor disturbances, noise complaints, the occasional altercation near the sports fields, the routine work of a public space on a busy afternoon. He had been on the North Path near the Aldgate Street entrance when the noise from the central fountain reached him, and he had moved toward it at a jog with his radio in one hand and his other hand already drifting toward his holster before he had seen anything at all. What he saw when he came through the gap in the crowd was a black teenager leaning over a motionless older white man, pressing down on his chest repeatedly with both hands. The man was not moving. The teenager was not stopping. The crowd was standing around them in a circle, and nobody was intervening. Callum did not stop to observe. He did not stop to ask the crowd what had happened. He did not stop to read the scene the way 12 years on the job should have taught him to read a scene before drawing a conclusion. He moved directly towards Solomon and said in a loud, hard voice, "Hey, step away from him right now." Solomon looked up. His hands did not stop. His voice was urgent and clear. "He collapsed. He has no pulse. I'm doing CPR. I'm certified. Please call an ambulance." Callum told him again to step away. Solomon looked at him for exactly 1 second and then looked back down at Albert Drews and kept going, because stopping meant Albert Drews died, and he was not going to let Albert Drews die because a police officer who did not understand what he was looking at told him to stop. Callum drew his weapon. Several people in the crowd shouted at once. "A woman said he has a certification. He told you. A man said he's saving him. What are you doing?" Solomon looked up again, this time at the weapon, and his voice shifted from urgent to something more careful and more frightened. The voice of a 17-year-old boy who has just understood that the situation has changed in a way that has nothing to do with the man beneath his hands. He said, "I am trying to save his life. Please, I am trying to save his life." Callum told him it was his last warning. Solomon looked at Albert Drews. He looked at the weapon. He made the only decision a boy who understood what stopping meant could make. He looked back down, repositioned his hands, and kept going. Brent Callum pulled the trigger. The bullet entered Solomon's left foot at 2:37 in the afternoon. He went sideways from the force of it, but he did not go far and he did not go quietly. He made a sound that the people standing in that circle would describe later in their statements as something they had never heard before and did not have the right word for. The sound of a person absorbing something that should never have happened to them. He fell onto his side on the grass beside Albert Druce, and for 2 seconds he was still. Then he pushed himself back up. Not fully upright, not the way he had been before. He was on one knee now with his left foot off the ground and his face tight with pain, and his breathing changed. But his hands found Albert Druce's chest again, and he tried to continue the compressions and manage 4 of them before the pain and the blood loss made his arms give out, and he went down again, and this time he stayed down. The crowd broke open. The quiet that it held while Solomon worked dissolved completely, and what replaced it was loud and immediate, and coming from every direction at once. People were shouting at Callum. A woman at the front of the circle was screaming. The man in the running vest, who had been standing still since Albert collapsed, was now moving forward with both hands raised, saying something that nobody could fully make out over everything else. 2 teenagers near the fountain were on their phones, both of them, and the way they were holding their phones was not the way people hold phones when they are calling someone. They had been recording. Callum stood with his weapon still raised and looked at what he had done. Solomon was on the grass. Albert Druce was still on the grass. Neither of them was moving. The circle of people around them was no longer a circle. It had become a crowd pressing in from one side and retreating from the other, the way crowds move when they are frightened and angry at the same time and don't yet know which one is going to win. A woman pushed through to Solomon and pressed her jacket against his foot. She was not a medical professional. She was a Parks Department employee named Willa Fenn, who had been eating her lunch on a bench near the fountain when Albert collapsed and had watched everything that followed. She had a basic first aid certificate and enough presence of mind to apply pressure to the wound and to keep her voice low and steady when she spoke to Solomon, telling him to stay still and that help was coming. Solomon looked up at her and said, "Is he okay?" He meant Albert Druce. Willa looked across at the motionless man beside him and then looked back at Solomon and told him to focus on staying still. Solomon said it again. "Is he okay?" He had been shot in the foot and was lying on the grass of Renfield Park bleeding, and his first question was about the man he had been trying to save when the bullet hit him. The ambulance arrived at 2:42, 8 minutes after Solomon had started compressions and 5 minutes after the shot. 2 paramedics came through the crowd with a stretcher and moved immediately to Albert Druce, and the assessment they conducted in the first 90 seconds told them that the compressions Solomon had been performing before he was shot had maintained enough circulation to keep Albert viable. They worked on him for several minutes on the grass before loading him onto the stretcher. He had a pulse when they got him into the ambulance. It was weak and irregular, but it was there, and the paramedics would later confirm in their official report that the intervention performed prior to their arrival had been a significant factor in the patient's survival. A second ambulance came for Solomon 4 minutes after the first. Willa Fenn had not moved from beside him the entire time, keeping pressure on the wound and talking to him in the same low, steady voice. When the paramedics reached him and took over, she stepped back and stood at the edge of the crowd and looked at Brent Callum, who was standing 15 feet away talking into his radio with his weapon holstered, and she looked at him for a long time without saying anything. Callum's radio call had been brief. He had reported a disturbance at Renfield Park Central Fountain, a suspect resisting lawful commands, and a discharge of his service weapon. He had used the word suspect. Solomon Mensah, 17 years old, certified in CPR on his knees trying to keep a man alive, had been filed in Brent Callum's radio report as a suspect. 3 other officers arrived within 6 minutes. They secured the scene, took initial statements from the people closest to the fountain, and separated the witnesses into groups. The 2 teenagers who had been recording were approached by one of the officers and asked to stop filming. Both of them had already sent the footage to other people before he reached them. By 3:15, less than 40 minutes after the shot, the video was online. It was 41 seconds long and it showed everything from the moment Callum raised his weapon to the moment Solomon went down the second time, trying to continue the compressions. It showed the crowd. It showed Willa Fenn moving to Solomon's side. It showed Callum standing with his radio after the shot with the same flat expression he had worn throughout the entire encounter. And it showed Albert Druce lying motionless on the grass, the man whose life Solomon had been fighting to save when the bullet found him. By 4 o'clock, the video had been shared several thousand times. By the time Solomon Mensah was in surgery at Renfield General Hospital on Crestfield Road that evening, having the bullet removed from the bones of his left foot, the number was considerably higher and still climbing. The witnesses didn't wait to be asked. That was the thing that made this different from the stops and the encounters and the incidents that usually disappeared inside departmental processes and internal reviews. The people who had been standing in that circle around Solomon and Albert Druce at Renfield Park Central Fountain came forward on their own, without lawyers, without prompting, without anyone telling them that their account mattered. They came forward because they had been there from the beginning, had seen everything, and were not willing to let what they saw get buried under whatever version Brent Callum had already filed in his radio report. 14 formal witness statements were collected by the following Monday morning. Every single one of them told the same story. A man collapsed. A teenager went to him immediately. The teenager began CPR. He was focused, certified, and doing everything correctly. A police officer arrived, misread the scene in under 10 seconds, refused to hear the explanation that multiple people in the crowd were shouting at him, and fired his weapon into the foot of a boy who was in the middle of saving a life. Not one statement supported Callum's version of events. Not one. Callum had filed his initial report describing Solomon as a suspect, behaving aggressively toward a vulnerable person, and refusing lawful commands to desist. He had used the language carefully, the way officers use language when they are building a paper record around a decision they have already made. But the language of his report and the language of 14 independent witnesses were so far apart that placing them side by side produced something that could not be explained away by interpretation or perspective. One of them was a description of what happened. The other one wasn't, and everyone who read both of them knew exactly which was which. The park security camera footage was pulled by the department's Internal Affairs Division on Sunday morning. 3 cameras covered the central fountain area from different angles, and all 3 were intact and uninterrupted. Investigators watched the footage in full that same afternoon. What they saw on those cameras aligned with every witness statement and contradicted Callum's report in every material detail. Solomon had not been behaving aggressively. He had not been threatening Albert Druce. He had been performing chest compressions on a man with no pulse, while a crowd of people shouted at the arriving officer that the boy was doing CPR. The cameras caught Callum arriving, raising his weapon, and firing. They also caught the 4 compressions Solomon attempted after the bullet hit him before his arms gave out and he went down. The Internal Affairs investigator who reviewed the footage filed an urgent recommendation for suspension before the end of Sunday. Albert Druce was discharged from Renfield General Hospital 6 days after the incident. He had suffered a cardiac arrest caused by an undiagnosed arrhythmia, and the medical team that treated him was unambiguous in their assessment. The CPR performed at the scene before the paramedics arrived had been the decisive factor in his survival. Without it, the outcome would have been different. They put that in writing and submitted it as part of the official medical record. Albert gave a statement from his hospital bed on the 4th day. He did not remember collapsing. He did not remember the park or the fountain or the grass beneath him. The first thing he remembered was a paramedic's face above him and a voice telling him to stay with them. But he had been told what happened while he was unconscious, and he had been told the name of the boy who kept him alive. And when the journalist who came to his room asked what he wanted to say about Solomon Mensah, Albert took a long breath and said that there was a 17-year-old boy lying in a hospital bed right now with a bullet wound in his foot because he refused to stop saving a life he had never seen before, and that he intended to spend whatever time he had left making sure that boy knew exactly what that meant to him. That quote went everywhere. It traveled faster than video and further than the witness statements, and it landed differently than any of the official documents, because it was just a man in a hospital bed saying the plainest possible version of the truth, and the plainest possible version of the truth was devastating enough on its own without anything added to it. Brent Callum was suspended with pay on Monday morning. By Tuesday, his name was national news. By Wednesday, 2 members of the city council had called publicly for his termination. By Thursday, the department's spokesperson had stopped using the word incident in their public statements and started using the word shooting instead, which was a small shift in language that meant something much larger about where the official position was heading and how fast it was getting there. Solomon Mensah was still in surgery when Callum's name first appeared on television. He did not see it. His mother did. The suspension lasted 9 days. On the 10th day, Brent Callum was terminated by the Renfield District Police Department following the conclusion of an expedited internal affairs review that the department's own spokesperson described as one of the most clear-cut investigations the division had conducted in its recent history. The camera footage, the 14 witness statements, the paramedic report, and Albert Druce's written statement had collectively produced a record that left the department with no procedural ground to stand on and no version of events to offer the public that the public was going to accept. Solomon Mensah spent 11 days in Renfield General Hospital. The bullet had fractured 2 bones in his left foot and caused nerve damage that his surgeon described as significant and potentially long-lasting. He would need physiotherapy for a minimum of 6 months. Whether he would regain full function in the foot was a question his doctors were not yet able to answer with certainty in those first weeks. His football coach, Terrence Obie, visited him on the 3rd day and sat with him for 2 hours and said very little, because there was very little that the situation allowed anyone to say that was adequate to what had happened to a 17-year-old boy who had done everything right. Solomon's mother filed suit within 2 weeks of the shooting. Her attorney filed against Brent Callum personally and against the Renfield District Police Department for failure to adequately train officers in threat assessment and scene evaluation. The filing was detailed and the damages being sought were significant. 3 of the 14 witnesses submitted supporting declarations alongside the suit. Albert Druce's medical team submitted documentation confirming the CPR's role in his survival. The case was as well supported on the day it was filed as most cases are after months of preparation, because the evidence had assembled itself in real time in a public park in front of dozens of people and 2 functioning security cameras. The city settled 14 months later. The settlement was reported by 2 outlets to be in the range of several $1,000,000. Callum's law enforcement certification was revoked by the state board permanently, meaning he could not be rehired in any policing capacity anywhere in the state. The department implemented mandatory scenario-based training for all officers covering medical emergency recognition, which was a formal acknowledgement in everything but name that what happened at Renfield Park's Central Fountain on that Saturday afternoon should never have been possible in the first place. Solomon returned to Renfield High School the following semester. He walked with a slight limp that his doctors said might be permanent. He completed his junior year, then his senior year, and was accepted into a pre-medicine program at a university in the state the following autumn. His football career, which Terrence Obie had believed had a real future, did not recover the way the rest of him did. That was one of the things the lawsuit listed under damages. It was also one of the things that no settlement figure was ever going to adequately cover, and everyone involved understood that. Albert Druce attended Solomon's graduation. He sat in the 4th row, and when Solomon's name was called, and the boy walked across the stage with his slight limp and his gown and his certificate, Albert stood up before anyone else in his row did, and he did not sit back down until Solomon had returned to his seat. If this story moves something in you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. A boy saved a man's life and got a bullet for it, and the least we can do is make sure that story is never forgotten. Subscribe to JPTV, because every story we tell here matters, and so does every person watching it.